Hi, I'm Carolyn Gage, and welcome to an interview with myself and Dr. Melissa Farley with Dr. Stripe Gandera, who will be um, conducting the interview. The title of this is Prostitution, Exposing the Myths of Liberal Feminism. And this came together because as a playwright, I have two abolition plays that were done as a reading with a talk back afterwards, where I was doing the talk back with Melissa, and it was being moderated by Stripe. And we just didn't get to cover everything we wanted to cover. So this is kind of a continuation of that. So I am a playwright. I do lesbian feminist work. I have about 83 plays, 9 volumes of plays, and I deal a great deal with survivors of sexual abuse as well as lesbian themed work. So, with that, I'm going to ask Dr. Farley to introduce herself.
Thank you for inviting me to be here. I'm delighted. I'm a feminist psychologist who was in clinical practice for many, many years, and then decided that I need to be more active in changing the things that were making women crazy, depressed, suicidal, and miserable. And so after a number of years and by chance, I got involved in the movement led largely by survivors of prostitution to end prostitution. And one of the first things I learned about prostitution is that it's where everything bad that can possibly happen to women happens in one little institution. It involves incest, childhood neglect and abuse. It involves battering and rape in adulthood. It involves a profound racism in all prostitution, poverty, systemic neglect by most cultures in the world, and above all, sexism, the oppression of women as a class, as a devalued class of humans. So it was a place for me to focus activism. And I've been doing research and writing and working with many, many other brilliant people on policy changes. So I'm happy to be here. And Carolyn, thank you for putting those two plays, Head in the Game and The Intimacy Coordinator. Thank you for putting those two plays together and donating the proceeds to Prostitution Research and Education, which is the nonprofit that I work for.
And now we will have Dr. Gandera introduce herself.
I thank you both for collaborating with me on this conversation today. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. My name is Stripe Gandera. I'm an academic. I have an academic background. Studied feminist theory and in particular feminists of color. And so long history of engaging with feminist discourse. And today is really the first day I'm talking about prostitution in a public setting and engaging in the deep dive with both of you. So I'm currently working in an academic institution in Chicago. And I look forward to moderating the next hour. So again, thank you both for your ongoing contributions to creating and informing culture and challenging widespread acceptance of the exploitation of women. I want to speak with you today as an individual trying to understand woke culture, or i.e. liberal feminists, and their stance that their aggressive embrace of prostitution and in that the advocacy for sex workers' rights and endorsing a decriminalization or legalization stance. So my goal in the conversation with you is to look at, unpack, interrogate, take the deep dive, whatever we should call it, to understand why the support of decriminalization is the liberal feminist position. and to ask questions about the talking points that this position uses to advance its argument. So my own understanding of liberal feminist position is that they are working under a number of false assumptions, which can be divided into two categories. We have false dichotomies, and then on the other side, we have this lexicon of obfuscation, which I hope to get into, and really take a cook's tour through some of these assumptions. So there are a number of false dichotomies that attempt to make a distinction between a good kind of prostitution and a bad kind of prostitution. And so I wanted to ask Carolyn, we'll start with you, and then Melissa, if there's something you wanted to add on to Carolyn's response to the first dichotomy that I introduced, obviously feel invited to do that. But then with the next dichotomy, Melissa, we'll start with you and we'll go back and forth if that makes sense. But certainly along the way, feel free to add on to the other woman's contribution. So let's first start with talking about the dichotomy adult versus child. And Carolyn, will you talk about how this dichotomy works and how it becomes a false boundary? Can we start there?
Yeah, well, there's pretty universal in liberal feminist circles understanding that child sexual abuse is a bad thing. And so, child prostitution, bad. Adult prostitution, empowering, good, feminist. But that distinction, when you go into real life scenarios with prostitution, it breaks down. And it breaks down in a number of ways. One of the first is that many of the women in prostitution, and I'm not sure the stat, I'm thinking it's like 60% or something like that. Dr. Farley would know that better than me, have histories of child sexual abuse, which is a form of grooming, desensitization, a learned role, learned helplessness, all of that. So you have someone groomed in childhood. And then what? Her 18th birthday, something that goes immediately at the stroke of midnight, criminal assault turns into an empowering career choice. How's that work? We're going to get into this more when we look at consent, what consent means in a situation where there's that kind of, traumatic history, and then again, there's a prostitution is just a wildly unregulated situation, and many of the adult women are not. Who's policing that? Does anybody care? Who cares? How would you find out? They have fake IDs. Are they lying? Or are they trafficked? And who cares? I mean, it's very difficult to really determine who's an adult and who isn't. That's, part of the problem. And so this very clear cut child prostitution, bad, adult, good. How does that actually, how can you actually determine that you're in the realm of the good prostitution by that term? And then another thing I wanted to say is there's a whole genre of pornography called barely legal. And let us assume for a second that the impossibility that everybody in that field is actually an adult, and they're not. But even if they were, what is that teaching? What does that say when you have millions and millions of men who are actively seeking out barely legal? Isn't that just a buzzword on the internet to perhaps throw law enforcement off the trail of trafficking of children? But it's disturbing that there's a promotion of, wouldn't it be exciting to pretend it was a child, which of course is actually creating a culture of men who lust after children, and all the performative aspects of that, where adult woman, what's she performing? Helplessness, terror. So that is a false dichotomy, and certainly a wildly unenforceable one. Dr. Farley, I'm not sure I covered that well. You've got something to.
Oh, it's great. I mean, I would just mention a couple additional things that support what you're saying, Carolyn, which is one of my favorite quotes about the fact that, as you said, a vast majority, 70, 80% of everyone in the sex trade was sexually abused as a kid. and it absolutely is grooming, or as Andrea Dworkin put it, incest is boot camp for prostitution. And we even have quotes from pimps saying, I didn't teach her this, her daddy taught her that. So it's absolutely true. There's a continuum of abuse and cruelty. I think pimps like them young because the younger a girl is, the more controllable she is. She can be kept, she's more likely to be terrorized, intimidated, actually physically controlled by locking her in a room or something than an adult woman is. And sex buyers like them young for the same reasons. They're more vulnerable, they're more manipulable, children are. And so I guess that's all I would say. And it's an utterly false dichotomy. And there are many anti-trafficking groups who raise millions of dollars by saying they're trying to save trafficked children. And I gently and not so gently have discussions with these groups that it makes no sense to me to abandon a human being as soon as they blow out their 18th birthday cake candles. That's the same person, just 2 minutes older. And as you say, she doesn't suddenly have agency or more power. She's the same person at a different point of age. So thanks for the question, Stripe.
Yeah, and building on, I guess, that idea, moving into a second dichotomy that I often hear as a talking point, that there's a good and a bad, that there's a voluntary is good, and forced prostitution is bad. And this, lays on top of age, with what you're saying, right? That it's more complicated than, I guess, and this will hopefully come up later too when we're talking about the nuance of language, but this notion that there's a voluntary acceptable form of prostitution. So Dr. Farley, would you speak to this particular dichotomy, and again, make that connection? I think it comes back to adult versus child.
Well, I think it does sometimes come to adult versus child, but it also has everything to do with class and race privilege. And the women I've been on panels with arguing about whether or not prostitution is liberation or voluntary, those women tend to have had privilege, race, and class. And even people that I disagree with completely on prostitution, when pressed, Julia O'Connell Davidson is one of the scholars that has said this. She has said, well, there's only, and this is a quote, there's only a tiny minority of women in the sex trade who freely choose it. And by tiny minority, she means 1 to 2%. That's like, I'm a lawyer, I'm a psychologist, and I decide, woohoo, for some reason, I want to spend 6 months prostituting. And I think I can make a lot more money for 6 months doing whatever in the sex trade than I can practicing as a psychologist. That actually does happen every now and then in the world. But I agree with Davidson, it's a tiny minority. And this is one of the huge lies in the field of prostitution and trafficking, Stripe. The pro-sex work folks flip that on its head. They say there's a tiny number that are trafficked and the vast majority are voluntary. In fact, as Davidson and I think the three of us would agree in our observations and reading of the literature, the vast majority are women who don't have another choice. And the words of survivors themselves describe this perfectly. Women in prostitution, they address the appearance of choice, the appearance of consent, but the fact of choicelessness in statements like prostitution is voluntary slavery, or prostitution is the choice that's not a choice. And these are all quotes from survivors. Or legal prostitution is like you sign a contract to be raped for money. These are all statements acknowledging that it looks like a choice, but it's not really. And that's how I see it, having learned from survivors, that it's not a choice. The money, the need for money for basic survival needs drives somebody's entry into prostitution.
So could you make the connection to class and race more specifically? I mean, there's a
Okay.
implicit, I'm understanding what you're
Yeah.
saying, right, about poverty, but being more explicit about the connection to class and race as you opened up your response.
Yeah, rich women don't go into prostitution. If you want to look at the institution of marriage as a harmful institution to women, you could say rich women have married one man and they are beholden or under the control of one man. And that's not prostitution. Prostitution is when you don't get to pick. You're poor, you need money, and you enter prostitution in order to get urgently needed money, or for a place to stay, or for food, or for drugs, or other things that you really need. So the people that are in prostitution are poor, and everywhere in diverse cultures like the US, where we have many different ethnicities of human beings and many different racial identities, the people that are in prostitution are grossly overrepresented populations of women of color, whether they're Latina, Asian, African American, Native American. There are many more women in prostitution that are women of color than in the rest of the US. And overwhelmingly in all parts of the world, Indigenous women are at the bottom of a class and race hierarchy in prostitution. Mm. You can see this play out on the streets. You know, Mexico City has, light-skinned women in one block for sale. They have all Chinese women in another block for sale. They have mostly Mayan women who are recruited from the country, from rural areas of Mexico, cheaper in another block. It's a stunningly racist institution. And you can see that every place. Look at the classified ads, online or in person. When a woman is advertised for sale for prostitution, yes, breast size, etc., age are mentioned, but right up there is her ethnic identity. That's what Johns want. They sexualize skin color.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Farley. And I just wanted to come back to the connection I was making at the beginning too about to the dichotomy between adult and child and voluntary and forced is the assumption that we assume that adults are there voluntarily. And just wanted to clarify my connection, what was going on in my head, right? Good that we point. Assume. Okay, let's move on to another dichotomy. Carolyn, if you would talk a little bit about the indoor versus outdoor distinction that liberal feminists often make as, again, a good versus bad kind of prostitution? Can you talk about?
Yeah, and this supports when people feel that legalizing prostitution is going to be a great thing. It's like, oh, it'll come off the streets. Good, because it feels almost intuitive. Indoor heat, bed, safety. You're in a hotel or whatever. Outdoor, bad, dangerous. The traditional dark alley where strangers rape you, that kind of thing. But again, if you look closer, that doesn't really hold up because of the nature of prostitution. And in street prostitution, the woman can experience much more agency in terms of changing her mind. Like something in the interaction, like, oh, you know what? She jumps out of the car, or she just turns and walks away from the car, or whatever. Um, but if it's indoor, maybe deals have been struck, it's an assignation, she is taken up to a room. Maybe there's, security people there even. And once she's in that room, she loses a lot of options in terms of, changing her mind, getting away, and you know, the control that the John has over the interaction is much greater indoors, in fact, because outdoors is you're visible. Um, I'm not expressing this well. I'm going to throw this over to Dr. Farley, but I just feel like that's a big one because we just associate, oh, amenities. Yeah, like Wi-Fi in the swimming pool, that's going to really help. But I think we're drawing on our own experience. Ooh, outdoors is scary. I always walk with my dogs. You're not thinking about the actual what goes on in prostitution and what makes for a dangerous situation and what doesn't. And brothels where the men have to check their ties and their belts at the front desk. I mean, that should send some alarm bells. Or rooms that have panic buttons in several locations. Again, you know, yeah. All right, I'm just leave it there. Dr. Farley.
Well,
I
yeah, I
would
mean,
I jump in and also say that it's, I think, useful to the conversation to also say, I guess, more about where do we get this idea? And Carolyn, you're getting to that too, but where do we get this idea that somehow indoor prostitution is safer, better, more good? If that comes up in what you were going to say, Dr. Farley, feel free to elaborate on.
totally. I mean, I don't know for sure where it comes from and what Carolyn suggested, our own experience of it being unsafe on the street at night for women is certainly true. But it's also true at a public policy level. I have seen advocates for sex work, that is, advocates for decriminalization, which we're talking about today, take advantage of what I have seen in action in San Francisco and a couple other places in Nevada too, which is out of sight, out of mind. There is a desire on the part of government officials, public policy folks, city fathers, keep it out of sight. We don't want to see it. If they don't see it, they don't have to think about it, and they can pretend it doesn't exist. And I really think that's part of what's happening. I also think Carolyn's point about how she's more controllable indoors is absolutely true. The most harmed, the most terrified, the youngest, the most drugged and raped are always inside. They're not on the street. They can't stand up. They may be restrained in conditions that only a John could get used to, only a sex buyer could get used to. If those women were seen, and I'm including the Sonagachi brothel complex in Calcutta, where an advocate walked me through, and I was horrified at all of the 8 and 10-year-old girls sitting out on the front steps in front of the brothels. And my friend said, oh no, those aren't the youngest ones. The youngest ones are all locked inside.
Mm.
So this is true every place, that the most controlled and the most damaged women are not in sight on the street. And it's also true that if it was so nice inside, why on earth do you have panic buttons? This one tech guy I know in Amsterdam told me he had seen in those little itsy bitsy window brothels they have in Amsterdam. You know, you see a woman in a window advertised for sale, and then behind her is a little cubicle with a bed. In those cubicles, there are not one, not two, but 3 panic buttons. So that, you know, and they never have pillows in it. Like Carolyn's saying, no belts, no guns in Nevada. You have to check your guns, no ties. But in Amsterdam, they don't have pillows because, as one pimp said, because they're a murder weapon. No brothel in Amsterdam has a pillow.
I'm thinking too about Rachel Morin's work experience she shared in her book, Paid For. She describes having more ability to decide whether to go with this man or not on the streets, that when you're faced with an indoor situation, you don't know who is on the other side of that door, who you're going to be met with. And I'm just thinking about the way power and resources work as well. We can assume that someone who has opted to, buy sex indoors has perhaps more resources, and with that comes a sense of entitlement, and those conditions that shape that experience as well. But Melissa, let's talk about the legal versus illegal. Again, thinking about these dichotomies that we hear coming out of the woke culture, the liberal feminist platform that is arguing to, advance sex workers' rights, that there's a good legal kind of prostitution that exists, and then obviously the illegal kind is bad. Can you elaborate on that dichotomy?
I can. I don't know if Carolyn, did you have something else to say? I saw you looking like you did, or shall I just answer that?
I just quickly say I was having flashbacks of my years of hitchhiking, and you have about a 5-second window to read the person that pulls over, and you get really good because if you make a mistake, it's terrifying, and I just was suddenly remembering many, many experiences of little things. Did they wear gloves? Were they wearing gloves? If they wore gloves, no, I never got in. Like, is there someone in the back seat? Is there, just like there's a computer in your brain that's just reading, reading, reading. If he's got sunglasses on, no, like trying to see his eyes, like just a zillion ways you read them and just realizing, yes. And, suddenly you're taken to a room because your services have been contracted for, and then you go in that room and you lose that ability. Because I would say not prostitution, just hitchhiking, a third of the rides I didn't take.
Mm.
It would be something where it's like, nope, not today.
Yeah,
But
Rachel Moore.
I wasn't gonna say that because like hitchhiking is not prostitution. I want to put, but I do remember having to read for those signs. So
Rachel Morin
pimps don't-
describes the ability to smell alcohol in their breath, right? That is an option on the street, that if you can smell that, she may decide not to go with this guy. But again, that shifts once you're indoors. You don't know. You don't get that.
Pimps do not permit women to exclude drunk customers indoors, whether it's a massage parlor, whether it's a legal brothel, whether it's a strip club. And the main money she's making in the strip club is going in the back room and doing blowjobs or other sex acts. Pimps don't let women turn down drunk customers. They're making a fortune inside by selling a drink. If you've ever been in a strip club or a legal brothel, and I've been in a lot of them, the drinks cost like $8 or $10 or
Well, my
something.
understanding is the women
So
are, the women are under pressure to meet a quota. You
there
know,
are, well, I guess the bigger picture, speaking of legal versus illegal, the big picture is most people assume that pimps are the people they see on the street and that those are the bad guys, the thugs, the criminals. Nothing could be farther than the truth. Pimps are frequently middle-class guys who own sex trade venues and or who are boyfriends or friends that are controlling a woman. In fact, the big myth is that there's only a few trafficked women, and pimping is trafficking. Trafficking is third party control over another human being, as in slavery. It's the quality of being owned, dominated, controlled, unable to leave, all of which is true of women in pimped prostitution or women who are trafficked. What percent of all women in prostitution are under pimp control? It's shockingly high. We've done a study of 18 different sources and asked that question to NGO directors, service providers, and also looked at research studies. And it looks like about 84% of all adult women are under the control of someone else. That means they're pimped. That means they're trafficked. So they have very little control over who they can, have sex with, perform sex acts with, who they can refuse, who they can say, get the heck out of here. And so that applies to legal as well as illegal prostitution. Pimping is legal in legal prostitution. They're just called business managers or owners or strip club, but they're pimps.
So this leads us to the, sorry.
Does that make sense? Does that answer the question? I don't know if it does. It's a little piece of the legal versus illegal.
Yeah, and I mean, I think our conversation about indoor versus outdoor too is speaking to the legal versus illegal, right? That there's just unpacking some of this, right, is useful, I hope, to listeners, and to think about these talking points that are everywhere in culture, require a little more, I guess, nuance and understanding. So that I think you've spoken to that. Is there anything, Carolyn, that you'd like to add to the legal
well,
versus
yeah, I
illegal?
mean, I think it's critical that this issue is so enormous. I forget the number of women all over the world. It's huge. And so when women are just, have an opinion about prostitution, what's it based on? Is it based on studies? Is it based on, in my field, did you see Best Little Whorehouse in Texas? Or did you watch the movie Pretty Women, which I made the point it's not ancient history. It was revived just a few years ago as a musical on Broadway. Um, like interrogate your assumptions. And we're trying to sort of provide some actual, reality here, because good women and good feminists have positions on prostitution that are based on absolutely false assumptions. And we learn over time not to even look at where our assumptions come from. It's enough that our whole peer group believes something. And it's hard to interrogate your assumptions because you might end up with an unpopular opinion. But that is welcome to feminism. That is the work.
So the final dichotomy, and Melissa, you've already spoken to this. I wonder if there's anything left to say, or additional to say about the distinction that is made between prostitution and trafficking, right? That is a distinction that is made. Often I hear liberal feminists making that distinction that, again, obviously nobody supports trafficking, while many of the liberal feminists, queer culture, even Black Lives Matter has a, support of advancing sex workers' rights, and is in support of prostitution. So can you talk a little bit more about this distinction that is made and where it breaks down?
I want to say that for me, it's heartbreaking that Black Lives Matter supports decriminalized prostitution. Absolutely heartbreaking. They're right on in their attack on institutional racism and racism in the police departments in the US. But the assumption that this is all Black people are going to get in the way of a job is absolutely outrageous for me. I have the highest standards for anyone of any color who's in or out of prostitution. They should be able to have a decent education, decent housing, decent job training, and a good job that gives them a feeling of dignity in life. And certainly there's no way prostitution is a dignified or acceptable job. And so my response to the BLM support of decrim prostitution is, you really think Black women, this is all they deserve? Because I disagree with that. And on the other hand, thank heavens, there are women like Vanita Carter who've done an analysis of racism in prostitution, comparing it to a form of slavery. And as we're learning in the last 5 years from historians, slavery was built on prostitution in the United States. The transatlantic slave trade, women who were raped by their owners, African women who were raped by their owners, were across the board sold as fancy girls. And there were whole trafficking networks when the US was being founded to sell them. And Vanita has pointed out, her organization that she founded 25 years ago is called Breaking Free. That's an Afrocentric program that accepts women of all color, but it's focused on the special cultural perspective of African American women in prostitution. I mean, Vanita's analysis was when she first saw white men from Minneapolis driving to neighborhoods of people of color as if they're plantation owners and picking this one or that one that they want to have for the night because they want, as sex buyers put it, something different. Again, hear the objectification and the dehumanization in that expression, but that's how they put it. They want to experience something different. So the racism in prostitution, it can't be separated from the sexism. They just are glued together like this.
Thank you.
Sorry, I went off topic a little
No,
bit.
it's all part of the conversation, right? Trying to compartmentalize and direct where we're going is an overwhelming task. So whatever,
Possible.
right? But let us make a conscious shift in moving from thinking about those dichotomies to now thinking about this lexicon of terms that obfuscate meaning. Some words being used to discuss prostitution hide the truth. And we've alluded to some of these terms, but I'd like to be deliberate in our kind of, again, unpacking of this simplified, reductive use of terms. I mean, when I was a feminist scholar, I mean, when I was in graduate school, the feminism taught me to ask questions and to look at the who and the why and the whose voice is being shared and the conditions of what we're talking about. And it seems as if that kind of analysis is lacking in the liberal feminist use of language, such as sex, consent, sex work, sex workers, sex trade, agency. But let's break some of these down. And Carolyn, I know you've taken issue with the working definition of sex in our culture, that you write about the limitations of our understanding of sex in your plays. So I'll start with you. If you could talk again about how this term sex is being used when we're talking about prostitution and what is problematic about that use.
Well, it's for one thing, the word sex is has largely been defined by the male experience of it. And there's two people involved, and that is sort of factored out. And that's just in the heterosex. Foreplay is, often the main event for women. But because the sex act is generally, has to do with his ejaculation, it's relegated to foreplay. Like it permeates the entire thing. Like, why are we saying vagina when we mean vulva? Because vagina is the part of women's genitals that the penis interacts with, and the clitoris is kind of not necessary for the male orgasm. So let's not use a term that includes that, because we're not interested in that. It's not relevant to us. It's just, that's a whole skewing of all the language around it. But sex is particularly problematic. Like, and if you take prostitution, the way people refer to it is, you're buying sex. No, he's buying a sexual experience for himself. As Rachel Morin in her book, she makes it so clear. The woman is not seeking him out for sex. She's receiving money for her services. And I just absolutely love that analogy when she said, that if you agree that someone can pay you $20 and then slap you in the face, it's not going, that money makes no difference. The slap is still a slap. The bruise is still the bruise, the stinging, the pain, the shock, all of that. Money does not affect that at all. It's paid abuse. And when a woman allows the man to, penetrate her and have a sexual experience, when she's not feeling any desire, and often she's actually feeling disgust, or perhaps she's drugged and she's numb and she's hardly feeling anything, but she's not desirous of this sexual encounter. She's needing the money or wanting the money. Why do we call that sex? He's having a sexual experience. She's performing. She's selling her services as an actress. And that's kind of my wheelhouse, because I work in theater. And one of my plays really dealt with that. In that case, there should be an intimacy coordinator, scripting consensuality of each behavior at every step of the encounter. We all laugh like, oh my God, who would pay for that? Well, ask yourself why it's a joke to think about having an intimacy coordinator in a brothel, because everybody knows it's paid abuse. And we call it sex if someone's having sex with a dead body, or with an animal, or with someone who's taking money for it. It shouldn't be, there's just this one word, because it obfuscates it. And that's where people come off with that liberal feminist thing, like, she's a sexually empowered woman, this is sex positivity. She's not having a sexual experience. Do you know any prostitute women? Have you talked to them? Or even just use your imagination. These are not partners they chose. He might be drunk, he might be disgusting, who knows, but that one word that encompasses it all prevents thinking clearly. If we were able to say, he's buying a sexual experience from a woman who might be completely not interested in sex right now, maybe she's having menstrual cramps, maybe she's disgusted by him, all of those things, then we start to think more clearly about it. Paid rape. Yeah, maybe that's what it is. He's not buying sex. He's paying her to allow him to sexually abuse her. So sex is just a great term. It's like, the vaguer the term, the less clearly people can set their boundaries. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Melissa, will you take on choice? And again,
Well,
we often hear women are choosing this profession, or this is a woman's choice. She's making an informed choice. Can you complicate the use of of how choice is being used?
oh my God, you're scaring me. Complicate. The postmodernists are coming after me. Let me just say one thing. That was such a brilliant explanation by Carolyn of what sex is and isn't, and what's being purchased in prostitution. But the other half of that expression is the word work. sex work. And what I'd say, just a couple things about prostitution as work or a job. And, I swear we can't compartmentalize this stuff, Stripe. We can't. I keep mushing into other topics that you bring up, and that's the way this all is in my mind. And in real life, you can't separate these things from each other. You just can't. So when someone calls prostitution work, here's what I think about that. Okay, I'm going to put out a trigger warning, folks. Bingo, bing, bing, bing. How is it work to have somebody your grandfather's age come on your face and smile during that while you may be getting herpes because he's ejaculating in your eyes, which is one of the ways you get herpes? Does that sound like kind of work that's a drag, like working in McDonald's or working on a construction crew? Not so much fun, hard stuff. You might have a nasty boss. You might get burned from a stove. The degradation and the refusal to tolerate dignity in a human being, the refusal to tolerate any boundary whatsoever. That's what the alleged job of prostitution is. And I would maintain that people who defend it as sex work and who say it's a choice, I think they're coming from a position where they've never had to imagine what it was like to really not have a choice, to really be hungry, to really not have a place to live. And I guess it's such naivete to call it a choice. It's just astonishing to me. I don't understand women who don't understand that we're all just a centimeter away from the choicelessness of prostitution if we live in a patriarchal, sexist, unequal society. We're just a hairbreadth away. I've always understood that myself.
I wanted to speak to that work thing because what gets normalized in prostitution could not really be normalized in other forms of work. And I just ask people to imagine showing up for their first day as a waitress and having explained that no one should come into the restaurant past the reception desk with a belt or a necktie, because we find that a lot of our customers get carried away and they will actually murder a waitress. So be sure to check, do they have those belts and ties? And if they do, send them back to the reception desk. And there is a panic button under every table, because we find that sometimes the customers, for whatever reason, maybe the order got screwed up, they have been known to beat the crap out of the waitresses or even murder them. So we have these buttons for you. This is a normal thing. I just ask people in their normal workspace, and as Melissa makes the point, yeah, being a busboy's grinding, or being a wait person, or a lot of work is not the most fulfilling, and sometimes it's really physically onerous. But just imagine those kinds of conditions. That's terrorism. And as an actor who was working on one of my pieces said, you started talking like that, and he worked in corrections. He said, I remember that in my office. And it's like, yes, and that's the normal, that is the workspace. That's the QB for
Yeah.
a prostituted woman. That's not normal. Those are not normal working conditions. It's
Well, we have laws
assault.
against sexual harassment. We have laws
Yeah,
against sexual harassment. And the name of the job of prostitution is sexual harassment. How crazy is that?
That's what I tried to make clear in my play, The Intimacy Coordinator. When you try to control that, what kind of
Yeah.
language is he going to use in the interaction? And let's script that, and let's make sure everybody's consensual with it. It's like, that's what he's paying for. He's paying for her to abdicate all those boundaries. without
Yes.
even knowing what that means. Just they won't be there. Because in any other job, that's actionable. Creation of a hostile job environment, I would say the panic button's right there. You know what? I think I'm in a hostile work environment. You know, exactly. It's not normal work. And I don't know if this is the point in time to sort of deconstruct the bullshit around prostitution unions or not, but maybe we'll get to that later. I'll leave that to you, Stripe.
Sure. One more term, and maybe you feel like we've already talked about this, but I want to talk about consent because again, this is the language that stops thinking, or this is a myth that deserves being exposed, right? That the well-intentioned feminists say, well, women are consenting to this, so I stand behind the women who is consenting to do this work. And again, everything I learned and everything within me as a woman living in patriarchy, I have to I have to understand more about this term consent. And so can we talk about that for a minute, and then we can end our conversation on unions if
Well,
that's where we
I think that one of the things that I found very moving was when you talk with and are friends with prostituted women, or you read memoirs. And there was a pornography star, Linda Lovelace. I wish I could remember her non-porn star name. It was Linda
Marciano, Linda
Marciano.
Marciano.
She wrote she wrote a really stunning book about her experiences, and she talked about, I think in Deep Throat, she actually, if you look carefully, you can see she's got bruises. You know, she's been battered. But who's looking for bruises? Woohoo! Big, you know, popular movie. She talks about having saying that she enjoyed doing a lot of things. If anybody interviewed her in a certain period in her career, she would have said, you know, I love doing this. No, I love my work. And in her memoir, it's an entirely different thing. It's almost like she's woken up from a dream or something like that. I also want to briefly mention another writer, the happy hooker. And that is a big trope that people love, the happy hooker. Wish I could remember her name.
Daviera Hollander.
Daviera Hollander, and that was a bestseller in all over the world, translated. She wrote a memoir later that hardly sold a book, and it was about her childhood. And she grew up,
Mm.
I believe, in a Japanese prisoner of war camp. She was an infant or a toddler at the beginning of the war, and it was a women's camp. And I don't want to just do trigger warnings for days, but what she experienced at 2 and 3 in the women's camp was torture, mutilation, very clearly remembered, by the way, very clearly remembered. And of course, the women would try to trade sexual favors to ameliorate their position. And it was just the most extreme gendered violence childhood I had ever read of in my entire life. And then later, after getting out of the camp, she was sexually abused by her father when they were reunited. And I was just like, oh my God. And I just felt like you should never read The Happy Hooker without reading this memoir because it is, you know, compared to what? What's empowering compared to that, you know, and thinking of the trauma and the major issues that became the center of her life. I feel like that this whole notions of consent and so many of these women talk about how I had a friend who was prostituted and she felt it was tremendously empowering to be a prostitute, like it was a glamorous profession and this and that. And she did it for many years, got out of it because of AIDS and the AIDS scare. You know, she felt it's just a question of time if I don't get out now. And then as soon as she left, she was in her midlife and she began to recover memories of being prostituted as a very small child and also used in pornography under the age of 5. She had amnesia for that. And it was, you know, she was really struggling with like all these things that she thought were true and thought were what she chose, that she was actually enacting programming that was not to her benefit. Again, it's like the mysteries of the human, the traumatized child's mind, amnesia, fusion with the perpetrator. is brainwashing. Consent becomes extremely difficult. And I just say, read, listen to these women, and they will say, "Oh, I used to say that. Yeah, I would have said that too." And then they've got a whole different thing when they kind of come away from it and wake up. But go ahead, Melissa.
I'm thinking about what I saw, Melissa, I think it was you shared this with me, but this common, right, saying that we hear it takes a village to raise a child, and shifting that, and it takes a village to think
To raise a
raise a
prostitute.
right. Thank you.
Yeah, I think, how does that bear on this discussion of choice and consent? Here's how I see it. Today, we absolutely, there's stratospheric inequality in the world and in the US. And if we don't look at that, the fact that, for example, we have data from 9 countries on 5 continents that shows a 75% overlap between homelessness and prostitution.
Mhm.
Now, what kind of consent is that if you're choosing between homelessness and prostitution? That's not what I would call a real choice from a range of alternatives. Only someone who is blind to class inequality could even say she's making a choice. And so I think the way most of us think of choice is a choice between vanilla or chocolate ice cream, a choice between college majors. That's not the kind of choice we're talking about in prostitution. We're talking about a coerced choice between having pretty much nothing or being in the middle of a consumer culture in either the US or any other culture in the world and deciding you have to have the latest iPhone in order to be a real 18-year-old grown-up lady, right? So that kind of consumerism does contribute to prostitution today, in addition to extreme poverty. And there's just no way that can be considered consent or choice. Women consent to egregious harms all the time in our lives in order to survive. We all know that. And that's what we're talking about in terms of prostitution. So that's my thought on that.
Thank you. So there are other terms we could, spend hours again looking at the language used in this particular movement. Agency, sex trade, contract sex. I'm really curious about when we hear them saying we want to advance sex workers' rights, what we mean by rights. I think that deserves a whole conversation. But perhaps we can end and kind of a segue to thinking about what do you say to it should be unionized, right? That this somehow links to this
Yeah.
idea of sex workers having rights, that if we unionize this industry, that life would look better for the prostituted people.
Well, again, it's trying to overlay the trappings of legitimate work with something that's paid abuse. So it's a stretch. But the unions, I'm going to let Melissa speak to the structure of them and who's paying for them. But one of the things that stood out that I think is a good way to kind of end on is that, the unions exist to kind of support what the workers want. And they'll do surveys of what do you want, what do you need from your union, what is the thing that's most needed. And when prostituted women are asked across wide demographics, what is the number one need they have, my understanding of it is that 90% will say resources and help in getting out. Now, just imagine an auto workers union where it's like they ask the members of the union, what do you want your union to do for you? Help us get the hell out of here.
Mhm.
that tells you something. It's not better wages or we want longer breaks or what. No, it's like, get me out. I actually cannot afford to leave. I need resources. I need help. Um, right there, you're not talking about a legitimate industry and you're not talking about a legitimate union because for starts, that's what they need and want, and the unions are not doing that for them. Let me be clear about that. Um, so anyway, so Melissa, why don't you speak to who actually are the leaders of these prostitution unions?
Well, I have looked into that because like you and Stripe, I haven't been able to make sense out of what the heck these unions are all about. Stella in Canada, Coyote Swap in the US, Red Thread in the Netherlands. They're all over the world. International Union of Sex Workers in the UK. Um, who started these? And it appears to me that they are largely pimp controlled. So it's as if the big bosses are running the unions, which is in fact the case. And I even looked into the sex work advocacy voices that are frequently interviewed and write articles. And many of these folks who describe them as sex worker advocates, who are leaders of unions, are in fact engaged in pimping or activities very much like pimping. The founder of the Sex Workers Organizing Project, SWAP, in the US, Robin Few, had a conviction for interstate trafficking. And she's the voice of the sex worker advocate when she was alive. This is common all over the world. The sad thing to me, and I guess the thing I'd like to end by saying, is that the sad thing is these are the voices that get heard, the voices advocating prostitution as a good job for women, the voices that say women are making a choice, that it's empowering. All of these people who are advocating prostitution, who are in fact, many of whom are in fact pimping, their voices are drowning out the voices of exited survivors, people like Vanita Carter, Rachel Moran, and many, many others, Autumn Burris. These are survivors who are exited, and there's an active attempt to suppress their voices. So I think when any of us, and the three of us know who are the exited survivors, who are abolitionists, I think when anybody listening talks to someone who says, oh, I'm a sex worker, I'm a former prostitute, you need to know quite a bit about them. Have they ever engaged in owning an escort agency, owning a strip club? I mean, many of these people have. So look beneath the surface a little bit on this issue. Don't just assume because you don't know much about prostitution, which is where we all started, that you have to take anyone's word for it. You really need to find out, are they a feminist? Are they interested in offering women real alternatives? Or like Carolyn said, are they just kind of shuttling women in one direction?
And I think maybe a good way to take this home, because we can go on forever, is Stripe. Maybe you could just point us toward an alternative, abolition, which is, advocating for the Nordic model. Could you say something about, because there's three positions people take. One is criminalize everything, arrest the prostitutes, arrest the Johns, and then there's decriminalize everything, get a union, whatever. And then there's a third alternative, which is the Nordic model. That it's called that because I think it originated, was it Norway or Sweden?
Sweden.
Yeah, it's been adopted in Canada and Israel, France. I think it's getting anyway. So Stripe, why don't you point us in a direction of a pro? What if I okay if I abandon my decrim position? What am I? What position should I take?
I I'm not thinking in that. I'm thinking about two other comments I wanted to end on. So let's
All right,
pass,
go ahead.
let's
Go ahead.
pass it to Melissa. Do you want to share
Well,
the
Nordic model.
okay, I'll say a couple things about the Nordic model, but I want to hear your two other
Well, I'm
comments.
thinking about two comments made, one by Rachel Morin that you cannot make prostitution safe, and the other, Andrea Dworkin, who obviously also came out of the sex industry, that the circumstances are irrelevant. Something about circumstances are irrelevant because you're still using the vagina, the mouth, and the rectum. And I'm just thinking about the response to what a union would look like. And no matter what you put in place, I hear the voice of Rachel Morin and Andrea Dworkin's points that you can't make it safe and you're still using the body to, yeah, and the results of that. But we can end on the Nordic model. If you,
Well, it's totally, I mean, it's real what you're saying, that it can never be made safe, that both Moran and Dworkin said, and that I completely agree with. It's like we have to, I want to give people credit who don't know a lot about prostitution and trafficking and the sex trade. I want to give a lot of people credit for kind of wanting to do something, but not knowing what to do. And so they kind of think maybe it'll get better by putting a Band-Aid on it. And Band-Aids are these unions or decriminal, not arresting people. Does arresting hurt women in prostitution? Yes. Is it true it's not a good thing? Yes. Is that a point of agreement between the pro-sex work and the abolitionists? Yes. We all agree, don't arrest the woman who is paid for in the prostitution transaction, or the man or the trans person. Don't arrest that person who's bought and paid for. We also agree on arrest the pimps, arrest the traffickers. Nobody likes them. Even, nobody likes pimps and traffickers. The point of contention, and this is where, in part, where the Nordic model law comes in, the point of contention is sex buyers. The pro-sex trade folks obviously want sex buyers actively pulling out their wallets and credit cards and paying. And people like the three of us or Moran or Dworkin think there's no way that the institution of prostitution is tolerable or non-abusive for women. It is unfixable. Essentially, a little like the institution of slavery, frankly. You can't fix it. So the only thing to do is abolish it. And I guess the one thing I want to say that I've learned from survivors in the last couple of years is, if you're going to arrest sex buyers, which is what the Swedes do, they actually have a felony level arrest, not just a little itsy bitsy misdemeanor, which is what we've got in a lot of the US states, but it's a serious crime. They don't implement it enough, but that's another problem. I was talking to a survivor the other day who said about the Swedish law, it's the greatest law in the world that was never implemented adequately. And that's a problem with a lot of laws. But we also, if we're going to be serious about ending the institution of prostitution, we must provide people with alternatives, which is shelter, food, job training, and everything that women in prostitution tell us they want in order, as Carolyn said, in order to get out. So services are essential in the Nordic model.
I think that's a good place to end. We've talked a long time this afternoon about a conversation that many people do not want to engage in or don't know how, at least not in any deep and meaningful way. So I thank you both for your commitment to the issue, to writing about it, to researching it, to centering the voices of survivors and those who are in it, and to focus on reality rather than the abstract and the theoretical. So.
Thank you for your moderation, Stripe. Brilliant.
Yeah, I'm gonna I'm gonna end now. So thank you all. And
Thank you,
oh, I
Carol.
want to direct you to Melissa's webpage, prostitution, prostitution research and education, right?
Yeah, prostitutionresearch.com.
Okay. All right. Bye bye.
Thank you.